Imagine the scene, the late 19th century, a time charged with political fervor and nationalism sweeping across Europe. In this context, Zionism began to take shape, not as an isolated phenomenon, but as a dynamic response to the prevailing nationalist currents. What was the driving force behind it? The objective was clear, yet ambitious, to create a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine. Why Palestine? This choice was a profound reaction to centuries of anti-Semitism, persecution, and marginalization, calling for a space where Jews could claim self-determination and safety. Theodor Herzl, a pivotal figure in this movement, envisioned a Jewish state in Palestine as the ultimate solution. But this vision was no simple path. It attracted both passionate supporters and fierce opposition, setting the stage for the complex and enduring conflicts that would later define the region's history. But where did the ideological roots of Zionism come from? Far from a spontaneous movement, Zionism was born from the broader political currents of 19th century Europe, where nationalism was stirring the hearts of people across the continent. In the wake of the Napoleonic Wars and the revolutionary waves that followed, ideas about self-determination and the rights of nations were everywhere. These ideas resonated deeply with Jewish intellectuals, who had long grappled with questions of identity and belonging. Within this fertile environment, many Jewish thinkers began to see themselves not just as members of a religious community, but as a distinct nation, a people with a right to their own land and sovereignty, instead of endlessly striving for acceptance or assimilation in foreign lands. Among these early voices was Moses Hess, whose writings marked a pivotal moment in the ideological formation of Zionism. Hess argued for the necessity of re-establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, envisioning it as the ultimate solution to the Jewish question in Europe, a question that had haunted Jewish communities for generations. In his vision, the Jewish people's historical and spiritual connection to Palestine would be the cornerstone of a new Jewish national identity, providing a solution that went beyond integration or assimilation. His ideas laid the groundwork for future Zionist thinkers and movements, which would take this foundational vision and mold it into a concrete political strategy aimed at building a nation. Now let's consider a darker but equally important force shaping Zionism, the brutal reality of anti-Semitism. During this period, Jews across Eastern Europe faced waves of pogroms and relentless discrimination. This climate of hostility wasn't a temporary crisis. It was a chronic, systemic condition that kept Jewish communities on the margins, reinforcing their sense of statelessness. Historian Walter Laqueur noted that this anti-Semitism, paired with the growing marginalization of Jews in European nation-states, drove many Jews to consider Zionism not merely as an ideal, but as a tangible necessity. In seeking a new homeland, Jews aspired to create a place where they could live as an independent people, free from the perpetual threat of persecution and rejection, a place where they could finally determine their own destiny. Consider the intellectual landscape of 19th century nationalism, a time when many thinkers saw political Zionism as the path to Jewish revival. Yet one voice rose in clear opposition: Ahad Ha'am, the pseudonym for Asher Hirsch Ginsburg, a Russian-born intellectual who became the leading advocate for cultural Zionism. Unlike the political Zionists, who emphasized the urgent need for a Jewish state, Ginsburg argued that a purely political project was incomplete. He envisioned something deeper, a revival rooted in the spiritual and cultural essence of Jewish identity. Can a state truly flourish, he asked, without a soul to guide it? For Ginsburg, the narrow focus on political solutions, on statehood and borders, overlooked the core of what Zionism could be, a force to rejuvenate Jewish culture, which he saw stagnating in the diaspora. He believed Zionism wasn't merely about solving the Jewish problem of anti-Semitism or lack of political rights. It was about addressing the Jewish question of cultural vitality and spiritual resilience. The diaspora experience, in Ginsburg's view, had sapped Judaism of its inner dynamism, leaving it diminished, in need of renewal. Ginsburg was cautious about mass immigration to Palestine, preferring instead a selective influx of Jewish intellectuals who would establish a model society. Imagine this select group of thinkers, an elite tasked with reviving Jewish traditions, embodying Jewish virtues, and serving as the cultural and spiritual mentors for Jewish communities abroad. This model society, he believed, could nurture Jewish identity and set a powerful example for Jews everywhere. So, what did Ginsburg hope to achieve through cultural Zionism? He envisioned a vibrant spiritual center in Palestine, led by a dedicated group of cultural leaders, writers, philosophers, artists, who would create a thriving Jewish culture, a model culture that would inspire Jews globally. This wasn't about building just another state, it was about creating an ethical and cultural beacon, something to reawaken Jewish identity worldwide. Through their work, these leaders could build a cultural bridge between Israel and the diaspora, allowing the Jewish homeland to serve not only as a physical refuge but as a source of spiritual nourishment. Ginsburg saw Zionism as a force for an ethical and spiritual renewal, offering the Jewish world a renewed sense of purpose and direction. In his view, Israel wasn't just a land, it was a cultural wellspring, a place that could revitalize Jewish values and reconnect the global Jewish community to their shared heritage and moral compass. But Ginsburg's vision didn't go unchallenged. One of his most vocal critics was Jacob Klatskin, who had a different vision for Zionism. For Klatskin, the primary goal was straightforward: establish a Jewish state where Jews could live as a normal people among the nations. He believed in normalization, the idea that the Jewish state didn't need to be a spiritual exemplar, just a nation like any other, offering Jews the right to live free of exceptionalism. Klatskin's approach was pragmatic, focusing squarely on Jewish self-determination, without placing unique moral or spiritual demands on Jewish identity. For him, the diaspora represented a condition of abnormality and dependence, where Jews were forced to constantly adapt and, as he saw it, subdue their national spirit. He argued that life in the diaspora inevitably led to either discrimination and persecution or cultural weakening and assimilation. Klatskin's fundamental disagreement with Ginsburg lay in the notion of Jewish identity itself. He rejected the idea that Jewishness had to carry a moral or spiritual distinction. Such a view, he argued, only limited Jewish freedom, pushing Jews toward a kind of self-imposed nationalism that bordered on chauvinism. In Klatskin's eyes, this approach conflicted with his ideals of liberalism, individual freedom, and the right to build a national identity unburdened by moral or spiritual expectations. Klatskin saw himself as a true liberal, advocating for a form of Jewish self-determination that allowed Jews to develop freely, as any other people would, unshackled by the constraints of a moral mission. For Klatskin, being Jewish wasn't about embodying a special ethical code. It was about reclaiming the right to be a normal people, free from the expectations of spiritual or cultural exemplarity. In sum, the debate between Ginsburg's cultural Zionism and Klatskin's pragmatic nationalism posed fundamental questions. Should Zionism seek to renew Jewish culture as a guiding light, or simply establish a state where Jews could live freely? Should Jewish identity be tied to a moral mission, or should it be liberated from such demands? This clash between vision and practicality continues to shape the conversation around Zionism to this day, highlighting a profound question. What does it mean to be a nation, and what role should identity play in the pursuit of that ideal? One of the most influential early Zionist thinkers was Leon Pinsker, whose work Auto-Emancipation, published in 1882, delivered a piercing critique of the Jewish condition in Europe. Initially an advocate of Jewish assimilation, Pinsker radically changed his stance after witnessing the violent pogroms that shook Russia in 1881. He came to a stark conclusion: antisemitism wasn't something Jews could overcome through integration or tolerance. Instead, he argued, antisemitism was deeply rooted in the European consciousness, so entrenched that it could only be countered by the creation of a Jewish state, a state that could offer Jews real protection against future persecutions. Pinsker's ideas were transformative, representing a decisive shift from passivity to active self-determination. According to historian Derek Penzler, auto-emancipation was a call to action, a rallying cry for Jews to take their destiny into their own hands by building a state through political organization and practical efforts. His work became a manifesto for early Zionist movements, inspiring a wave of practical Zionism focused on establishing Jewish settlements in Palestine. Early efforts to bring the Zionist vision to life took shape through movements like Chibat Zion, meaning love of Zion, and Hovevei Zion, meaning lovers of Zion, which emerged in Eastern Europe toward the end of the 19th century. These groups were more than just ideological, they were practical, dedicated to fostering Jewish immigration to Palestine and creating agricultural colonies on the land. Shmuel Almog notes that these movements arose amid a surge of anti-Semitism in Russia and Eastern Europe, viewing Palestine as a haven from the relentless expulsions and discrimination Jews faced in their native lands. Hovevei Zion was one of the most active early Zionist movements, laying the groundwork for practical Zionism. With support from wealthy philanthropists, they organized Jewish immigrants and began establishing the first agricultural colonies in Palestine. These settlers, or halutzim, worked to create self-sustaining communities that would embody the Zionist ideal of rebuilding a Jewish homeland connected to the land of their ancestors. By the close of the 19th century, these initial settlements were critical to Zionism's future. Historian Gershon Shafir highlights how these early efforts transformed the demographic and economic landscape of Palestine, marking the first step in bringing Zionist ideals to life. Theodor Herzl, born in 1860 in Budapest, initially believed in the promise of assimilation for Jews within European society. As a journalist and playwright, he spent time in Vienna and Paris, where he was deeply affected by the rising tide of antisemitism, particularly during the infamous Dreyfus affair in France. This scandal, in which a falsely accused Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, was publicly humiliated, opened Herzl's eyes to the persistence of antisemitism across Europe. He saw it as more than just a social prejudice. It was a structural problem embedded in the fabric of European society. These revelations led Herzl, in 1896, to write his seminal work Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, where he argued that Jews must abandon the dream of assimilation and instead establish a sovereign state of their own. In Herzl's view, such a state was the only enduring solution to anti-Semitism. Without statehood, Jews would remain marginalized, permanently vulnerable to prejudice. Palestine, with its strong historical and religious ties for Jews, was the natural choice for this new homeland, although Herzl emphasized that it could only succeed with international backing. Herzl's visionary approach marked a defining breakthrough in Zionist theory, advocating for a proactive and organized pursuit of a Jewish state. Herzl's most significant political achievement was the organization of the First Zionist Congress, held in Basel, Switzerland, in 1897. This Congress brought together over 200 delegates from Jewish communities around the world, marking the formal establishment of Zionism as a structured political movement. Herzl's success in assembling this Congress and setting a clear Zionist agenda showed his remarkable ability to transform an abstract idea into an organized, actionable movement. The Congress established key goals, including the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine and the mobilization of Jews worldwide to support this project. The Zionist movement was structured as a political and diplomatic organization, with the express goal of securing international support for a Jewish homeland. Herzl articulated his vision with remarkable clarity at the Congress, famously declaring, "I have founded the Jewish state. Whether in 5 years or perhaps in 50, everyone will see it." Herzl understood that the journey would be long and demanding, but this Congress marked the beginning of Zionism's global influence and laid the foundation for what would become a transformative force in Jewish and world history. The heart of Theodor Herzl's strategy was diplomacy. He believed that gaining international support was essential for Zionism's success. Herzl understood that achieving the Zionist dream would require backing from Europe's great powers and, crucially, from the Ottoman Empire, which then controlled Palestine. With this in mind, he tirelessly pursued negotiations with key figures of the era, including the British Empire, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Herzl's diplomatic journey was marked by both progress and setbacks. In 1901, he met with Sultan Abdul Hamid II, hoping to secure permission for Jewish settlement in Palestine under Ottoman rule. Herzl offered financial support and modernization projects in exchange, but the Sultan declined, fearing that Jewish settlement would disrupt the demographic and political balance within the empire. This rejection underscored the challenges of establishing a Jewish homeland through political agreements alone. In Britain, however, Herzl found a more receptive audience, particularly among pro-Zionist politicians like Joseph Chamberlain. British interests in the Middle East, driven by their imperial ambitions, opened up possibilities for future Zionist aspirations in Palestine. Although Herzl never secured formal support from Britain during his lifetime, these early connections would prove significant in later years. While Herzl was a unifying figure for the Zionist movement, sharp divisions soon emerged over the best path forward. The main factions were political Zionism, represented by Herzl, and practical Zionism. Herzl's political Zionism focused on securing diplomatic backing and formal recognition as prerequisites for establishing a Jewish homeland. He believed a Jewish state could only be secured through agreements with major powers, gaining international legitimacy before any large-scale settlement efforts could begin. In contrast, practical Zionists argued for immediate action on the ground. They advocated for Jewish immigration to Palestine and the establishment of agricultural settlements, regardless of diplomatic progress. These practical Zionists believed that building communities in Palestine would create the foundational conditions for statehood, making the vision of a Jewish homeland a reality from the ground up. Menachem Usishkin and the early pioneers, or so-called Halutzim, embodied this pragmatic approach, taking action by establishing settlements and working the land. This tension between political diplomacy and practical action reflected deeper disagreements within the movement and continued well into the 20th century. While Herzl's political vision became an influential symbol, the practical approach eventually gained prominence, especially after Herzl's death in 1904, as settlers on the ground continued to expand Jewish presence in Palestine. Zionism's rise in the late 19th and early 20th centuries stirred reactions not only among Jews in Europe, but also among Arabs in Palestine and key international players. The Zionist goal of creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine raised concerns among the local Arab population, who saw the land as their home and heritage. At the same time, international powers began to play a role in shaping the fate of Zionism, with Britain eventually taking a central role through the Balfour Declaration. Early Arab responses to Jewish immigration were initially fragmented and local. According to historian Rashid Khalidi, Palestinian Arabs at the time had a limited sense of national identity, which made organized resistance difficult. Early Jewish land purchases and immigration didn't immediately seem like a major threat, and some Arab landowners even sold land to Zionist organizations, often unaware of the long-term implications. But as Jewish immigration increased and land acquisitions led to the displacement of Arab tenant farmers, tensions began to rise. This was particularly felt among the local rural population, who saw their livelihoods affected. Khalidi notes that Arab landowners and intellectuals were the first to voice concerns about the social and economic impact of Zionist settlements. These early disputes over land ownership and labor marked the beginning of a conflict that would escalate throughout the 20th century. The land question became a focal point of Arab resistance, as the growing presence of Jewish settlements threatened Arab control over resources. Historian Neville Mandel explains that the first organized political expressions of Arab opposition to Zionism began to take shape in the early 20th century, as Arab politicians and intellectuals mobilized to protect their land rights. These early efforts laid the groundwork for the more organized forms of Arab nationalist resistance to Zionism that would emerge in the years to follow, setting the stage for a prolonged and complex struggle over the future of Palestine. The Ottoman Empire's stance on Zionism was marked by a cautious and often ambivalent policy. Sultan Abdul Hamid II and his officials were wary of allowing large-scale Jewish settlements in Palestine. Why this reluctance? According to historian Hassan Kayali, the Ottomans feared that an increase in the Jewish population could disrupt their political control over the region and lead to instability among the local Arab population, a group the Ottomans depended on to maintain order in their southern provinces. In fact, Sultan Abdul Hamid II rejected multiple appeals from Zionist leaders, including Theodor Herzl, who sought Ottoman support for establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. The Ottomans saw Zionism as a potential threat, worrying it would create an autonomous enclave within their empire, undermining their sovereignty. Yet, despite the central government's strict stance, there were instances of local officials and Arab landowners cooperating with Zionist organizations by selling land to Jewish settlers. This reflects a complex dynamic. While the central Ottoman authority was wary, local economic incentives sometimes led to a pragmatic acceptance of Jewish settlement efforts. The Ottoman government's official policy on Zionism was never entirely straightforward. The Sultan's ambivalence also reflected an attempt to balance between pressure from the European powers, who advocated for Jewish rights in Palestine, and the Ottomans' own desire to maintain control over their territories. As the Ottoman Empire weakened in the early 20th century, especially following World War I, managing the growing tensions in Palestine became increasingly challenging. The Great Powers played a critical role in the development of Zionism, particularly Britain, which had growing strategic interests in Palestine as part of its broader ambitions in the Middle East. In the early 20th century, Britain began to see an opportunity in supporting a Jewish homeland, a position that aligned with its imperial objectives. With control over the Suez Canal and a vested interest in securing routes to India, Palestine became central to Britain's strategic calculations. The most significant international development came in 1917 with the British Balfour Declaration, in which Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour expressed Britain's support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This declaration was the result of British diplomacy and intense Zionist lobbying, marking a major victory for the Zionist movement. Historian David Fromkin describes the Balfour Declaration as a political tool, aimed not only at gaining Jewish support during World War I, but also at strengthening British influence in the Middle East post-war. While the Balfour Declaration represented a historic step forward for Zionism, it also sparked considerable tension with the local Arab population, who felt ignored and threatened by these new developments. This British commitment fueled rising conflicts between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, setting the stage for territorial and political disputes that would define the region for decades to come. The rise of Zionism was anything but monolithic, a movement characterized by diverse ideological streams vying to define its goals and methods. Thinkers like Ahad Ha'am called for a spiritual and cultural renewal, envisioning Israel as a cultural center for Jews in the diaspora. On the other hand, figures like Jacob Klatskin criticized this idealism, advocating a pragmatic approach aimed at establishing a normalized Jewish state without specific spiritual obligations. Early Zionist thinkers and leaders, such as Moses Hess and Leon Pinsker, laid the groundwork for a political movement seeking to establish a Jewish homeland as a solution to antisemitism and the marginalization of Jews in Europe. Early Zionist movements like Chibat Zion and Hovevei Zion turned these ideas into concrete action through Jewish immigration and settlement in Palestine. This period marked the beginning of a new chapter in Jewish history, with nationalism and self-determination becoming central elements of Jewish identity and political life. Theodor Herzl, the undisputed architect of political Zionism, transformed a scattered idea into a global movement with the clear objective of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. His vision, presented in Der Judenstaat and advanced through the First Zionist Congress in 1897, laid the foundation for Zionist projects throughout the 20th century. Though Herzl's diplomatic efforts to secure international support were only partially realized in his lifetime, his influence and strategic vision remained central to Zionism's success, and ultimately to the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. Reactions to Zionism from Palestinians, the Ottoman government, and international actors highlight the ways Zionist ambitions clashed with existing power structures and interests in the Middle East. Initially disorganized, Palestinian resistance gradually intensified in response to the social and economic impact of Jewish immigration and land acquisitions. The Ottoman Empire's ambivalent stance toward Zionism reflected its struggle to maintain control over Palestine, while international players, especially Britain, saw Zionism as a tool within their own regional strategies. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 was a turning point, strengthening Zionism, but also laying the groundwork for the enduring conflicts between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. In the next lesson, we'll explore the Arab claim to Palestine, with a particular focus on the Ottoman past. Following the time of Muhammad, the Arab people embarked on a rapid conquest of the entire Middle East, beginning with the capture of Mecca and then moving into Syria and Palestine. The Ottoman Empire emerged around 1300, pushing the Arabs back and ultimately conquering Palestine in 1517. The Arabs remained under Turkish rule until after World War I, but we'll delve much deeper into this in the next lesson and those that follow. Don't forget to subscribe to the Academy of History and Culture to learn more about this complex conflict. See you next time.